The dog and I are out here in Austins Ferry. This building here is, as you can see by the sign, James Austin Cottage. It was built in 1809 by James Austin. Austin was a convict. He was a normal person living in England until the British powers turned him into a convict. They did this because the military in Van Diemen's Land needed to populate the place and populate it with convict labour. His crime was stealing a couple of beehives. It's a pretty trivial crime now, but it was a trivial crime back then too. It certainly didn't warrant putting him on a boat and determining that the rest of his life be spent on a very faraway island, completely foreign to him and removed from everything that he knew. After Austin got out here, he worked and then he was released, and when he was released he was given a land grant like a lot of the convicts were if they behaved well and were seen to be generally good guys. Austin got to work. He set up a ferry, and that's how this suburb got its name, Austins Ferry. Ferry went from the Derwent just down there, but he was a very good businessman. Over time he turned this whole area into a bit of a fiefdom. Now when you come here, and on days like this, there's not much going on except the breeze and the birds, but it used to be a massive hive of activity at one stage.
Austin's cottage was saved in the 1970s when the Glenorchy City Council almost demolished it. Today it claims to be Australia's oldest workers' cottage in its original makeup. Upon his release, Austin was granted 12 hectares of land on the banks of the River Derwent, north of Hobart town. In 1816 he established a ferry service across to Old Beach. For the first time, people and their goods could be regularly transported across the water on the trade route to Launceston. This was 2 decades before the Bridgewater Causeway was opened at Black Snake. Using wealth generated from the monopoly, he established a large orchard, grazed livestock, and erected a series of buildings and structures, mostly now lost. A large inn, known as Austins, impressed then-Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who used his thumb of authority to rename the inn and the area Roseneath. The inn fell into ruin in the 1920s before being demolished, materials of which were used elsewhere in the area to make things like driveways. A wall, built nearby around the same time as the inn, has survived to today, if only just.
The dog and I, we're just chilling here on this dry stone wall. This wall is a small mystery. No one really knows when it was made. Not exactly anyhow. It was probably built around 1819, 1820. That seems to be the consensus, but there's no recorded document of when it was put down. It's called a dry stone wall because it's made without any sort of mortar. When you go out into the bush in Australia, the ground is covered in rocks, stones. So once you've cleared all the trees out, when you try and turn the place into a farm basically to graze cattle or plant crops, you get all the stones and you heap them together and you turn them into walls. Now it's an invention that came out of Europe that was brought over here by the English and all the convicts that were put to work here. This wall is actually really quite long. It's not an excellent example in the terms that it's not perfectly built. It's a very good example though. An excellent example of one of these walls will last about 200 years if it's perfect. This one was built over 200 years ago, so even if it was superb, it'd be falling apart. A few years ago, they put this stuff on top. This is concrete. It's obviously not original. It's been put here to preserve what's left so that it doesn't fall apart even more. It's an unglamorous solution to the problem of degradation. Everything falls apart. Every building that's ever been built will eventually fall apart, and all you can do in the meantime is try and hold them together for a bit longer if you think that's something that's worth doing. the dog and I here in the ruins of the Austins Ferry train station. This is a retaining wall. It was a platform, and if I had been sitting here just a few decades ago, maybe even a decade ago, and I had had my feet out, I'd find my legs removed from my body, but there ain't no trains coming through here anymore. There's just guys walking their dogs. Everything that's been built in Hobart is permanent. No, it's not. Everything's impermanent. You can't build things to last because by the nature of everything on earth, everything falls apart eventually. It doesn't just apply to the buildings or the train lines, it applies to the mountain that sits above the city and the river that slices the town in half. That'll all change eventually. It's going to occur long after you or I are gone, but it's inevitable. So you just have to sort of accept that things go away. Everything changes.
Shortly before his death in 1831, work was finished on Roseneath House, which had been designed to replace the inn. It was one of the most impressive buildings in Tasmania, not just for the house itself, but also for the massive stable built beside it. Roseneath House was destroyed by bushfire in 1967. From 1803, about 75,000 convicts served time on the island. Tasmania is described today as a place built on the back of convict labour, but it's also the place that defeated the system of organised transportation. By the 1830s, the anti-transportation movement was slowly gaining support, but it took long, hard years of momentum before eventually stopping in 1853. New South Wales had already ended transportation by then, while Western Australia continued to accept male convicts all the way up until 1868. Surviving convict transportation, Austin became wealthy and well known in the colony, but he never married and his estate passed to his nephews.
Austin's empire belongs to the bunny rabbits now, but he's gone too, so it doesn't really matter. The point about him is that he was a winner, and he was so during a period of time, during a small portion of history that didn't have a lot of room for such behaviour. Convict transportation was incredibly harsh, and it only ended not because people in England decided it was unethical. It stopped because Tasmanians decided that they weren't going to take it anymore. Through political activism and protest, they made it stop. It's one of the great moral victories of Australian history, and it's something that we could allow ourselves to feel proud of. We weren't around then, so we weren't responsible for it, but it could, if we wanted to, have it form part of our identity, part of the idea of Tasmania, part of the idea of Australia, not just as a place, but as a society. In contemporary Australia, in a place like Hobart or any other capital or smaller town, the average bloke or Sheila might feel that the dice are loaded, that all you can ever do is roll snake eyes. Back in the 1800s, the dice were held in a tight fist that belonged to a ruling aristocracy in England. The nation's never quite been able to chop off the crown from ruling the place, but in the 1800s, Tasmanian people did chop off the oppressive limbs of England. And today, more than ever, that place is foreign to us.